Well, thank you very much. Thank you for reading my book. Thank you for bringing me here. I'm pleased and honored. I was at a class earlier today, and the discussion revolved a lot around what could be done or what the United States could do, how it could use its aid in a place like Afghanistan or places like Iraq to actually help those countries get stabilized and recover sort of a healthy, peaceful society, such as they may or may not have had at one point. In the case of Afghanistan, there was a peaceful society earlier on. And so there was discussion about should there be highways built, should there be, more spies, somebody said, and all the different ways that money could be used in a place like this. And of course, one of the problems is that the orientation that one might have coming from the United States is to use the money in such a way that they could build a culture and a society in the world just like this one. And then there are many problems with that. So I was thinking about the fact that I was thinking about my return to Afghanistan last summer. And I had tried to get back there earlier. I got only to the Pakistan border. I couldn't get in. The war was going on, and it was dangerous to go by land from Peshawar to Kabul. So I didn't get in that time. And then later I tried again, and in July, an air link had opened up, and I was able to go to New Delhi and fly to Kabul from there. And so for me, this was the first time in 38 years that I was going back to Afghanistan. And when I lived in Afghanistan, in some sense, I dressed more or less like this. And so did people of my class, government bureaucrats and educated urban folks. And the people of the villages dressed a different way. You could see the difference. And men had beards, and they wore something called pirana tumbon, which is men would wear this long skirt over these baggy trousers, and women sort of wore pretty much the same thing, a slight variation. And in our minds then, that kind of an outfit denoted that you were a village guy and you were, traditional and less educated and so on. And later on, during all the troubles that happened in Afghanistan, that image of the bearded guy with the traditional headgear and the baggy trousers and all of this sort of thing denoted perhaps somebody who was more oriented towards being a Taliban type of person. So I was intimidated by people who looked like this when I got on the plane, and there were some people who had suits on and looked Western, but there was other people on the plane who dressed in this traditional tribal dress. And right next to me, there was a very fierce-looking guy, and he had a big beard, and he had the trousers and all that. And I was worried about what this guy would think when we began if we were to talk, because I was very conscious of the fact that I had been in the States for 38 years, and probably he'd been in Afghanistan, and there had been war, and so many people had died and stuff. And of course, he would resent someone like me coming back to Afghanistan, and I would represent someone who was that hated other thing, the modernist, the Western type of guy. Well, at some point, he turned to me and he tried to speak to me in English. He said, "How are you, sir?" I said, "Oh, in Farsi." I said, I'm actually an Afghan, and I've been in America for all these years, and I'm coming back." And instantly, he was so warm and sweet to me, and he switched to talking to me in Farsi, and he said, he referred to me as Biadar Khan, which is a sweet brother, and he gave me the address of his shop in Kabul and insisted that I should come and see him, and he wanted me to stay in his house and all this kind of stuff. And so I said, "Well, what are you doing in Delhi? What's going on with you?" He said, "Well, I own a shop in the bazaar there, and I want to start a business." And I said, "Really? What kind of business do you want to start?" He said, "Well, see, now I have the idea that now that the Taliban are gone, there's going to be a big market for cosmetics in Kabul. And I want to open a factory and make lipstick and things like this." And I thought about how wrong I was about who this guy was, you know? And then he went on and he said, with this market opening up, Afghan women are going to buy these things from Dubai, or people will import that stuff from Dubai and possibly from Delhi. And then all our money will go to those places, and why shouldn't we make this thing ourselves? And I agreed. And then he said, optimistically, or not knowing who I was, he said, when you see Karzai, well, I'm not sure I'm going to see Karzai. He said, well, if you do, tell him to get the banking system worked out so that there can be loans to people like me, because there's so many people who want to start these businesses, and we have ideas, but we only need a little bit of money, but we can't get started. So what I was thinking about, and what I discovered once I got to Kabul, and then I traveled a little bit north of Kabul, what I discovered is that at that point, just within 6 months after the Taliban being driven out, there was a tremendous energy and optimism in Afghanistan. The place it was one of the most wonderful 2 weeks I've spent, and many other Afghans I know who went back at that time came back with that same sort of euphoric feeling about the time they spent in Kabul. And the euphoria was surely in part because after these 20 years of horrendous war, people in Afghanistan really felt like maybe this is over now, maybe peace is coming. And everybody had a scheme. And so there was a completely the basis there to, if there could have been at that point funding for all these schemes, then the basis was there to establish a kind of an entrepreneurial thing going on in Afghanistan that came from Afghans themselves. And so before I go any further, I'll say that I think is my sense of the way that money could be used in a place like Afghanistan to do the most good. But now I want to switch over to another aspect of the thing, and then we'll come back to this money stuff. And that's the political aspect of what's going on in Afghanistan. And after the Taliban were driven out, you may or may not know, but I'm going to go ahead and summarize this anyhow. After the Taliban were driven out, there was a conference in Bonn, Germany, and the UN sponsored it, and America and other big countries kind of stood by. And various groups of Afghans were brought to a conference table, and a government was cobbled together out of that conference. And the thing about that conference, however, which was it occurred right after the war that America had prosecuted in Afghanistan, but it was not a peace conference like you have usually after a war, in which the victors sit on one side of the table and the losers sit on the other side and terms are dictated. In fact, the losers were not at this conference table. The Taliban were not there. And, the Al-Qaeda people, of course, were not there. And who was there were all the factions in Afghanistan that had existed in 1992 when the last communist president and, sort of the puppet of the Soviet Union, the last one of those guys fell in 1992. And the U.S. had been helping the rebels that were fighting the Soviets all those years. And at that moment, there was a conference that did not happen. The U.S. pulled out, the Soviets were driven out, and all those factions that were fighting in Afghanistan tried to sort out their business on their own. And what they did was to storm into the cities, because they were not, in fact, one group, and they started fighting over the scraps of what was left in Afghanistan. And a country in which the countryside had been tremendously ravaged during that war. You can drive around and just, hour after hour, you'll come to villages that are just these rubbles and ruins. That's in the countryside because the Soviets were bombing from the cities. Well, after the Soviets left, all these rebels came rushing into the cities, and much of the cities now look like those countrysides. And my neighborhood, for example, is like that, and you can drive for hours in that neighborhood and never see a single house standing or a wall standing. It's just rubble. And it looked much more rubbly. I'd just been in Rome before I went in there, and it looked much more rubbly than the ruins of Rome. Those are in good shape. What it looked like very much was the city that was downriver from where I lived. Those of you who read my book, you'll know that I lived in a place called Lashkargah. There was this ancient city down the river. That one was 1,000 years old and had been destroyed in a campaign back then. And 1,000 years later, we used to play in those ruins. And now the house that I lived in when I was a kid looked like those ruins after 10 years. So all of that happened, and then in the wake of that, there was enough of a hunger for peace that when the Taliban suddenly rose up out of the refugee camps in Pakistan and they started coming into Afghanistan, in city after city, people were willing to let them in and turn the keys over to them on the assumption that they're going to make the fighting stop. And in fact, they did make the fighting stop in lots of places where they took over. So now, excuse me, in this peace conference in Bonn, it was the various warlord factions or the various rebel factions. I'm going to say in a minute why I don't like the word warlord and try to move away from it, although it's such a reflex now, it's hard not to say warlord. But it was all the different commanders and rebel factions, and it was the people who had held power before the Soviets invaded, and it was the exiles who had formed a technocratic, bureaucratic government class in Afghanistan, again before the anti-Soviet war. So this was the conference that should have taken place in 1992. And there's a lot of us who think that if such a conference had taken place and the same kind of government, cobbling together of a government had occurred in 1992, there would have been no civil war and there would have been no Taliban. But woulda, coulda, shoulda, that's over with. So now they sat down and they put together this government. And it was a very ticklish and difficult business to put together a government in Afghanistan, because there is contradictions and pressures and dynamics in Afghanistan that have existed in that society for a long time and were very much exacerbated by this war. Part of the contradiction, one of the main contradictions, is this ethnic business. And the problem here is that Afghanistan has many ethnicities, but there are three that are main ethnicities. And in order not to confuse you for the moment, I'll just call them A, B, and C. So the problem here is that A and B share a language, but are divided by religion. One is Sunni, one is Shia, two different branches of Islam. B and C share a religion. They're both Sunnis, but they're divided by language. One speaks Farsi, one speaks Pashto. So, there's 3/3 that they're at odds with one another. The biggest group are the Pashtuns. And for 200 years, the Pashtuns ruled the country and formed, in many ways, the upper class, the aristocracy. They're not a majority of Afghanistan, they're the biggest minority. Now, a complication is that at least half the Pashtuns live in Pakistan, not as exiles, not as refugees, that's just where they live. The border of Afghanistan was created out of historical circumstances a little over 100 years ago by the Russians and the Brits. And they said, this is a good place to draw a border. You don't come south of here, we don't go north of there. And it was for the convenience of those two big powers that this border was drawn. But the border goes right through a territory in which one coherent set of people lives. Now, the additional complication was that the Taliban had their support and their roots right in that part of the Pashtun homeland, the place where the border runs and bisects that territory. So the Pashtuns of southern Afghanistan, amongst them, there is support for the Taliban. So now when they sat down to put together this conference, not only were the Taliban missing, but the southern Pashtuns were not really represented in that peace conference either. And how do you make a government that has some credibility when excluded from that government is the single biggest group? That's a difficult thing. So the finessing of that was to give the top job to a Pashtun, and that Pashtun is Hamid Karzai. So they put Karzai in the middle. He's the neutral center around which all the conflict kind of rotates. And then the rest of the cabinet positions were divided up amongst several different groups. One group is the king's faction, the various aristocrats and royalty that ruled Afghanistan for many years and have lived outside the country since the Soviet takeover for the most part. Kind of another faction, but in many ways associated, are the people like my family who are not royal but had status and position in the old days and had government positions. Then there is the Northern Alliance, so-called. And the Northern Alliance is actually inside the Northern Alliance is one group that is the Northern Alliance, and that's the cohorts of Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was a Tajik. That's the other big ethnic group. So he was assassinated just before 9/11, but his buddies are still very much there. And they got the three most powerful positions because on the ground, at the moment when the Taliban were driven out, they in fact had the military power. Then each of the warlords gets something. Each of the major warlords gets something. One cabinet position here, one cabinet position there. All of these guys are warily circling the throne where the neutral Hamid Karzai sits and waiting for him to be lifted out so they can go for each other. And it's a very unstable, it has the potential to be a very kind of ramshackle, unstable government. Now, the source of the instability is very much in the fact that the Pashtuns are, or at least feel that they are, underrepresented in the government. And all of the people in southern Afghanistan are open to the blandishment that you got to get rid of this government. This is no good. We're not represented here. Meanwhile, the ethnic divisiveness and passion and tension has risen to such a degree that aside from anything else, the Tajiks and that third ethnic group, the Hazaras, feel like their backs are against the wall. If they if they put down their guns, they're afraid they're going to get massacred. So in this situation, that government has the problem of trying to disarm the population and trying to reconstruct and restore the society and the economy and all these things, while it is to the interests of, for the moment I'll call them Taliban remnants, along the border, to do whatever they can to make that society ungovernable. And they can do that, or they can help their cause at any time by killing somebody. You know, they can kill an aid worker, they can kill a government minister. Anyone they kill adds to the tension and instability and disorder. The government can counter that by, well, it's hard to know what they can counter it with. You know, the job of the government is much, much harder. They have to counter by having built schools 10 years ago, you know, because it takes time for peace to develop. It's hard to do something instantly that'll make things better. So what the government, and then there's another problem here that I just want to throw out. Oh, if only that government had some money. That would be the other thing the government could do. They could have money and they could go to some area where people are suffering from the after effects of war, and they could say, "Where's your head guy? We want to talk to him about what do you guys need? Irrigation system? We got some money. We'll help you out with that." When there is a one-to-one sort of relationship between people in the government and rural leaders, then in this way, slowly you build up some network of obligations, and then there is something in place besides who's got the guns. The way it is at the moment, however, in many parts of Afghanistan, the actual ruler is one of these guys that we call warlords. Now, when I was in Afghanistan, I had the experience of, I was in the foreign ministry where my cousin works, and I talked to the deputy foreign minister, who's actually a guy from Fremont, Fremont, California, who has gone back to do a job there, as are many of the people in the government. You know, many of them have spent the last 20 years or so here in America. So I went and talked to him, and he told me, Tamim, you got to tell, when you get out, you got to tell everybody about the problem with these warlords. And I said, yeah, I know, because I've read about them too, and I know all about that. And I said, I'm with you. I'll talk about that. Later, somebody took me to. They said, you have to speak to Dr. Shams. He's a bright guy. So I said, okay. They took me to his house, and in many of the houses where a government official lives, there'll be a couple of soldiers at the door, and those soldiers are new draftees. So they're ordinary guys, and they put them in a uniform, and they give them a gun. At the house of Dr. Shams, no soldiers. And I said, what is this guy? They said, nothing. He didn't get a position in government. He used to teach economics at the university. So they opened the door. We went in. I saw that inside is where the soldiers are for this guy. His yard is full of guys with guns. And unlike the draftees, they look like pretty serious guys with guns. I mean, with those draftees that are all over Kabul, wherever we went, I had a guy that I'd hired to drive me around, and when they barred the way, we'd argue with him and say, what do you mean I can't go there? Or, I have a paper here, and you take any old paper and try to... And it worked. But but inside this guy's compound, you could tell that you're not going to mess around that way. And still that didn't click anything with me. So I went in, we sat down, and Dr. Shams was very, very nice guy and very polite and stuff. And he said, what do you want to know? I said, well, in your opinion, what can we do about the problem of the warlords? And he said, well, first let's ask ourselves, what is a warlord? He said, in my definition, a warlord is some guy with, say, 10 guys that have weapons, and they make their living off the people. They don't do any productive thing. They just hold up and, people on the road and so on. That's a warlord, in my opinion. He said, these guys that they're calling warlords, these big people who administer provinces, if you were to knock one of them out, you would have 100 warlords. Because that guy is in place, there's only him. He's doing that. He's keeping peace in that area. He's making it possible for people to begin to do the things that are the arts of peace, plant their fields, start a business, do that kind of thing. And indeed, some of these warlords are like incipient kings, and they are administering their territories, and they're collecting taxes. And one guy in the north, Dostam, mints his own money, and the fellow in Herat has independent diplomatic dealings with Iran. So, in a way, something is starting to take shape here that is the re-feudalization of Afghanistan. It's going back to the way it was almost before the Mohammadzays were in power. What can be done about that? And the United States maybe isn't helping because, as a practical matter, in the various places where they have their activities, they tend to deal directly with the warlords and pay the warlords. In recognition of the reality on the ground. But if they would work through the Karzai government, then gradually the warlords might be weakened. So the way we have, what's going on in Afghanistan right now is that throughout the South, there seems to be gradually increasing disorder. More of these ambushes, more of these hit-and-run stuff. And whenever I see that reported in the paper, it's attributed to Taliban remnants. So now I'm going to just say a little thing about the Taliban. That phrase, Taliban remnants, suggests that the Taliban are a political party of whom there is a limited number, finite number, however many there might be. There's 5,000, 10,000, whatever it is. and they have job titles in the organizational chart someplace, and remnants means that most of them are dead now and a few are left. And when we kill those few, then there will be no more Taliban. But I really don't think that's how it is. I think Taliban is a vague word that describes an attitude, sort of a social cultural affiliation, and that in the discontented tribal southern area of Afghanistan and the corresponding area in Pakistan, there can be organizations that grow and disappear in the course of a couple of months, and they wouldn't be big. They'd be however many people know each other personally and take it into their heads. Let's help the cause. The more that there's discontent and that kind of shared attitude, then the more it's possible for these hit and run things to happen, and it doesn't have to be directed by anybody. It doesn't have to be part of anybody's master plan. It can just refuel itself, and I think that's what's happening. So that's the thing that would make us think that all hope is lost and things are going to go back to the way they were after 1992, and they would if the U.S. pulled out right now and didn't continue to supply aid or even actually raise the amount of aid that it offers. However, there are actually some good things that are happening, and I think there's reason to suppose that there's another trend and process too, and that is that, first of all, the longer that unstable government stays around, the more stable it gets, because people get used to it. They say, okay, this is, and they make friends a little bit. The Tajiks and the Pashtuns in the same government, they start to mingle at parties and stuff. So there's that, and there's also in those 200 years that the old royal family ruled the country, they were dealing with a situation where there was tribal chiefs everywhere, and they had autonomous power in their areas, and they had a few wars with those chieftains. So that was a feature of history in Afghanistan during that time. But they also had diplomacy with those tribal chieftains, just as if they were foreign countries. In old Afghanistan, the interior minister, the minister of the interior, was not the guy in charge of parks and stuff. He was like the foreign minister, except with the countries inside of Afghanistan. And through a long process of diplomacy and negotiation and traditional Afghan things, interconnection and knowing somebody who knows somebody and strategic marriages and stuff, gradually the country was brought into some kind of a unified and coherent system. And there's a little bit of that going on now with the Karzai government, and they've done some interesting things. Karzai took a big chance a few months ago when he asked several of the, kind of ordered, it was a delicately done thing, several of these big provincial leaders to come to Kabul and talk about the taxation question, and they came. And he said, okay, you're here, let me hear what your answer. Are you part of Afghanistan, or do you swear allegiance to the flag of Afghanistan? And they all said, yeah, we do that. And but that was, still that was good. He said, come to Kabul. They came to Kabul. He said, are you loyal? They said yes. And then they talked about money, and those guys all promised to turn over some of their revenues to the capital. I don't know if they have, but the agreement was made, so that's good. And just a month ago or so, he did something. There was a big warlord type of guy in Kandahar, the second biggest city. Gul Agha was his name, and powerful guy. And the first plan of the government was wherever there's one of these big provincial commanders, they appoint him governor. Then he's got a title in the government. They don't try to fire him. Well, in a way, they moved the first of these guys. They switched places. They gave Gul Agha a cabinet job. He came to Kabul and became the housing minister. And the housing minister was appointed governor of Kandahar, and he went and took Gul Agha's job. So these two guys switched places. I think that's a good move, diplomatic sort of thing. And slowly, many of these kinds of things might succeed in bringing peace without the sudden increase of bloodshed. I think I've used up my time, you guys, so I'm going to come and sit down, and then these guys are going to ask me some questions, and then you will, if you.
Okay, I was just wondering if traveling around and speaking about your book and your experience has changed your understanding of the text and your understanding of your own past.
You mean the text of my book? Mm-hmm. Well, there's a funny thing happens when you write a memoir. One of the aspects of that process for me is that in writing the book, I had not made a concerted effort to remember my past, especially the parts that happened in Afghanistan. And I wrote most of that stuff over the 3 years before 9/11, and it wasn't. I had no concept of what book that was going to be part of. It just occurred to me that, what do I remember? So I sat down, and that's all I tried to do was remember. And my experience was that the first time you think about something that you haven't remembered for a long time, that you have maybe not thought about since it happened, the first time you think about it, it's an authentic memory, and it's really vivid, and amazing stuff happens. And you remember one thing, and it leads to another thing, and it leads to another thing, and it leads to another thing. And if anyone's going to write a memoir, here's my piece of advice: write it down then. Get the text down right then, because as soon as you've written it, it sort of becomes the formal statement of your life, and it becomes the official version. And it's hard to argue with your own official version. It's stamped in your memory, and then you remember remembering it. So, what's happened to me after writing the book and then going around and talking to it is there's some of me has kind of talked myself out on it and written myself out on it. I find my own spirit trying to get outside the box of my life as it's been and say, what else have I been besides this thing? So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
My question was, in what big ways do Afghans and Americans view life differently? And sort of what Afghani ideals do you think Americans should adopt in order to live a better life?
Well, it's complicated for me to address that question because there's things that I would like to have in my life that I don't have because I'm not living an Afghan life now. And if I were to talk about that, one of the things that comes to my awareness is that I'm choosing not to have those things because there's a trade-off and I'm choosing this other. But I'll talk about what it is and talk about how difficult it is to have both. It all comes down to individualism versus having your primary consciousness of yourself be as a member of your group. And for me, someplace along the way, I became somebody who thinks of myself as a sovereign state, and my relationships with other people are at the ambassadorial level. And I find it difficult to relinquish that in order to be part of the family in a certain way, because to be part of the family in that way, you have to not own your own life. And yet, when you have your individualism, the independence that you've gained from that is a lonely thing in a way that I think is difficult to even imagine if you haven't been part of this other thing. So, that said, I can still say that my experience of life in America is that we are sort of slipping away from having access to being part of a larger social entity in a heartfelt, experienced way. Community, family, I don't know what it is, and I think we feel it because I think that a sense of that slipping away is what drives our politics when something like family values has tremendous appeal and power. It evokes something that we want to have in our lives that we feel like we don't have. One of the aspects of our life in America is that, we all organize our life in a very each person has charge of their life, and even down to within a family, we raise the question of what the rights of the children are versus so everybody has their rights, and economically that enables us to be a very efficient machine. I mean, we are incredibly able to regroup, reform, and swarm a problem in a way that I think a society that's bound by all of these clan, family, tribal connections just can't do. It can't do it because the energies of people and their main focus, 90% is expended in managing your social relationships in the network that you're a part of. You just can't ignore that. So we have that sort of productivity and that efficiency. A society that doesn't have that has a difficult time standing up to a society like this in terms of when there's a conflict or when the question of productivity comes up. I was thinking about when we went to Pakistan last year, me and some Afghan guys, and we had a job. We were going to deliver these blankets to these refugee camps. So our orientation towards that, as Americans, was that we knew what our goal was, and whatever we did amongst ourselves, we were doing our job, and we all had responsibility to the job, not to each other. And we were in the care of an NGO, a non-governmental organization that was Pakistani, and they spent all their time deferring to and managing and relating everything to do with the social network and having courtesies and etiquettes that would help us to continue to function that way and not ruffle anybody's feelings and not make somebody feel like they'd been insulted or it's like everybody. And as a result, we'd get up in the morning, and our goal was to get to the refugee camp by 10 o'clock, and we'd still be in the building at 3 o'clock, and I couldn't figure out why we hadn't gone anywhere. And when I went to Afghanistan, my cousin worked in the foreign ministry, like I said, and she would say, "Come to meet this other guy," and we'd start that way, and it'd be on the other side of the building. There was not one single office we could pass by without being invited in, and we had tea. And it took 45 minutes to get across down the hall to see some other guy. And if we had said to one of those people, "I'm sorry, we're busy right now," well, that would have been insulting. That would have meant that person was less important to us than whatever this stupid thing is we're trying to get done. It's like, so a society like that has a hard time being productive and efficient and aggressive and really get it done. But at the same time, it was true in Pakistan, but even more true in Afghanistan, that even in this country that had suffered this devastating war, and everybody is missing a hand or a foot there is something about being in Kabul. For me, my experience of it was there was a level of stress that was missing that I didn't even know was there until it wasn't there. It felt like the air had been thick and I could breathe now, and that came in part from even in the biggest, most crowded street that looked boiling with activity. If I looked at any particular person, they were taking it easy. They were like not in a hurry. And when I came back to the States, I had the day when I took I was going to drop my daughter off someplace to meet a friend and then go meet my wife for dinner at this other place. And so I went downtown and I got caught in traffic. Or I dropped my daughter off and I said, I'll come around and see if your friend is there. I want to make sure. Well, going around the block, I got caught in traffic, and it was like 5 minutes and 10 minutes, and I was tearing my hair out. And what if she decides to say, oh, he's not gone, and then she'll go, and then I won't know if she met her friend. I'll have to park someplace. And I went around, and indeed she wasn't there. And I was sure that she had just said, he's never coming back. Let's just go. But I couldn't take that chance, you know. She might have been kidnapped. So I had to find parking. and then I couldn't find parking. It was far away. And my wife has a cell phone, thank God. So after I parked, you know, and then I found my daughter, and it was 10 minutes past 6. I was supposed to meet her at 6. And it was 10 minutes past 6. And I went to I found a payphone, and I called her cell phone. And what is it with cell phones? They work except when you when you need them. And she was in a tunnel, or I don't know where she was, but wherever she was, the reception wasn't coming through, so her cell phone didn't work. So there was nothing to do but leave my car where it was parked and jump on the BART. And I jumped on the BART. Thank goodness that it was right there. This is the underground train, and it took off. And I said to somebody, "This is going to the Embarcadero, right?" And they said, "No, it's the other way." Well, in the end, I got to, I made it to where I was supposed to meet my wife at 6:25, and I realized that, you know, my brain was burning, and I realized that I would never have this experience in Afghanistan, because nobody expects to get anywhere on time. And since nobody expects to get anywhere on time, when the other person gets there, they don't sit there waiting for the person they're meeting and look at their watch. They start being there with whoever's there. And after a while, if the other person doesn't come and for some reason they decide to go, they say, well, I guess it didn't work this time. And I'll go, and maybe we'll do it some other time. And they go, and nobody feels any sense of betrayal or any. And, you know, that's something that feels pretty good, actually. but it's not very productive.
Ambrose Bierce, American humorist, once stated in the Devil's Dictionary that God invented war to teach Americans about geography. Clearly, most of us did not know much about Afghanistan before the war. In your opinion, how has war in Afghanistan changed the perception of Americans towards Afghanistan?
In the end, probably not very much, but you know, for a while it did. An Afghan at an event she gave a speech, and she said, I always remember these words. She said, you know, for 20 years I was here, and when I said I'm from Afghanistan, people would say, where? And in the last couple of months, when I say I'm from Afghanistan, people say, whereabouts? You know, during the Soviet war, and especially after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, there was a lot of Afghanistan in the news. But it wasn't like what was in the news after 9/11. In 1980, what was in the news about Afghanistan was very much like what is in the news about Iraq now. After 9/11, there were many articles that I saw anyhow that were trying to get under the skin and say, who are these Afghans? What is their life about? What do they live like? You know, I contributed to that to some degree, but other people were asking that question and trying to get an answer to it. When the war in Iraq started, I became conscious that even I, who is from very close there and, you know, have many reasons to know a lot about Iraq, actually know very little about it. You know, I don't know what it's like to walk on the streets of Iraq or be at home in an Iraqi house or or when a dinner party is happening, who might be there, what's it like, the texture of Iraq, it's like their music. I don't know that stuff. What's popular? What's the popular music? I don't know. And I don't see that kind of coverage has come about with Iraq, because it sort of feels like it hasn't even occurred to anybody to say, what are Iraqis like as human beings? It's like that. So that was asked a lot about Afghanistan in the first year after 9/11. And of course, now since there is so much coverage of Iraq that's dropped away, and pretty soon I think people will kind of forget again, and it'll go back to the way it was. To me, that's perfectly natural. It's like I don't have this this feeling of wait, you have to wait, and keep thinking about us, because there's so many parts of the world you can't think about everything. That's true. It's just politically, I think it's important to focus on the fact that Afghanistan in particular, and some other places, but it's easy to suppose that Afghanistan does not matter politically to America, and I think that's really not true. And that if America were to abandon Afghanistan the way it did in 1992, that would really set the stage for fragmentation and chaos and a civil war. And that obviously I myself would be deeply aggrieved by that because of the way that people would suffer in Afghanistan as a result of that. But I think it's of concern to Americans too, simply because that civil war in Afghanistan laid the groundwork for the Taliban, and the next one could do the same thing again. So it would all be for vain, or it would all be for naught, or whatever, if America were to pull out now, and especially if it were to pull out as a helping hand person for helping to restore the society. And as long as I'm on that, let me just soapbox it a little bit here. After the military operations were done in Afghanistan that the Bush administration conducted in 2001, 2002, and that was successful, and the Taliban were driven out, and then, I felt like that was a moment when there was a tremendous opportunity to make a difference in this whole business between Islam and the West. Because Afghanistan is a country that historically has two things going for it. One is that it has credentials in the Muslim world that are unimpeachable. There's no question that Afghanistan is a Muslim country and deeply Muslim and all that stuff. There's no kind of ifs, ands, and buts about that. But then the other thing is that many parts of the Muslim world are carrying a chip on their shoulder because of colonialism. The Islam in those places has taken shape in response to the humiliation imposed on them by being permeated by a different other and finding themselves in their own societies, like Egyptians or some people in places like that, finding that in their own countries there's clubs they can't get into because they're natives. It's like, that's a very humiliating thing. Well, Afghanistan does not carry that chip on its shoulder because it was never colonized. And the Islam there is not shaped by resentment. So there was the basis there for the U.S. to be able to show that we're not out to crush Islam or anything. They could have really come in and said, we're going to help without trying to change Afghanistan. We're going to let you guys be what you're going to be. And if they had done that, Afghanistan would have reconstituted itself as a conservative but unhostile Muslim society. And then that would have been a tremendous sort of, PR boost for the U.S. But instead, just in terms of PR, the U.S. did something that I thought was ruinous, even if they weren't planning to put significant money into reconstruction. They might even have pretended to, because what they said instead was, we've done the military part and that's all we do. The reconstruction is up to somebody else. And that was like making sending a signal that was unraveling of the potential good that came out of that. And then, the drumbeat immediately began for the war in Iraq, and I think a lot of opportunities were lost in the course of that whole thing.